Bonjour tout le monde. Good morning, everyone. Bienvenue. Welcome to all of you. It's such a pleasure to see everyone here in this beautiful city of Bordeaux, this beautiful campus. I'm Hélène Rey. I'm the current European Economic Association president. And as you can imagine, as you can see, this is actually a very, very special Congress this year. This is a very special Congress because it's the 40th anniversary of the European Economic Association. And with this short movie that you have been seeing here, we are trying to look back to our origins a little bit to get this community feeling that is missing from a lot of current events. And we're also trying to celebrate, and this is definitely a great place to celebrate. And we're also going to be looking forward. So I'm going to hand over to Abby, but before I would also very much like to thank the local organizers here in Bordeaux. So there's Jean-Marc Figuet and Anne Aurin are there, and thank you so much for all the work. It's really wonderful to be here. And we're going to have an absolutely great program put together by Johannes Bohm and Abby Adams, whom I'm going to hand over now for the first the Young Economic Prize and then the Marshall Lecture. So, Abby, please.
Okay, well, it's my kind of job to announce the winners of this year's Young Economist Award on behalf of the committee, which was made up of Johannes Bohm, Mara Scaccini, and myself. Now, before announcing the prizes, I just wanted to note the exceptionally high level of the quality of papers from junior economists at this Congress. So many records, it turns out, were broken in terms of, for example, the number of eligible submissions that were graded A+ or A. We had over 80 papers that met that criteria. We then went to the criteria of what's the number of papers, or the set of papers that were explicitly kind of drawn out by graders and by the field leads in each of the research fields. That left us still with 66 papers, which were A or A+, and were kind of thought to be prize-worthy. So I think I first wanted to note that there's an awful lot of really, really talented junior scholars in the room today and over the Congress. It's been a real privilege, actually, to get to engage with so many of these papers as part of being on the committee. So we obviously then had a really hard job of actually narrowing down this huge set to kind of single out a winner. So we actually didn't do that. We were able to kind of whittle it down to what we thought of as kind of 3 papers, actually, that we wanted to recognize in this forum. In alphabetical order, I'd first like to, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the 3 and then I'll call you all up at the end. So I wanted to say congratulations to Gerard Maidou-Moreau at the Toulouse School of Economics for their paper, Amenity Bias Technical Change. Just to give you a brief idea of what's in this paper, we've kind of written out kind of fuller explanations of the papers and why we wanted to recognize them that will appear on the website. But just to give you a taster, in this paper, so we all know that a job is more than just a wage, and it's characterized by a bunch of non-pecuniary characteristics like safety, job satisfaction, flexibility. And what this paper does is ask whether these non-wage amenities have a first-order impact on our understanding of productivity and changes in welfare at the macroeconomic level. Because a lot of this research is typically focused on quite at the micro level. And so we felt that this paper's novel and careful combination of micro and macro labour perspectives to shed light on these important macro trends made this paper worthy of a prize. The second person I'd like to kind of recognize is Bernardo Ribeiro at the Einaudi Institute for their paper, Growth with New and Old Technologies. So this paper uses 2 centuries worth of US patent data to document a set of new empirical regularities about innovation and like the age and vintage of technologies, and it interprets these new facts through the lens of a growth model. And by quantifying the welfare gains of reallocating research effort towards younger technologies, we felt that this paper really offered some new and very valuable insights for innovation and long-run growth. And we felt that the careful blend of both the empirics and theory made it worthy of mention today. And so the final paper that we'd like to recognize is by Jean Sorin at the University of Chicago, and this paper is called Public Roads on Private Lands, Land Costs and Optimal Road Improvements in Urban Uganda. And so the point in this paper is that transportation infrastructure is essential for development, but empirical evidence on its net returns is typically scarce. So the paper uses amazing data from Kampala in Uganda and combines reduced form evidence with the estimation of a quantitative spatial model to kind of quantify and explore different aspects of optimal policy. And again, we felt that this novel combination of data, of high-quality reduced form, and of structural evidence made this a prize-worthy contribution. So I'd like you to all join me in congratulating these 3 authors. And if they're in the room, if they could come up and I can give you your certificates. Okay, thank you. Keep the clapping, keep the clapping. Congrats. Okay, you can stop now.
Wonderful. So let us continue. I'm so happy to introduce Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, who is going to give this year the Marshall Lecture. Katya did her PhD in Harvard in 1999. Then she moved back to Moscow as an assistant professor in the New Economic School, where I was very happy to meet her for the first time in my life. I was back then a master's student. Katya then got promoted to associate professor, full professor, and then moved to Paris School of Economics in 2010. Since then, she published in all top journals we all would love to publish, won a number of outstanding awards. She is now an editor of American Economic Review, Journal of Economic Literature, used to be an editor in Journal of Public Economics, Economic Journal, and a number of other outstanding journals. Last but not the least, she played a very important role in my career. So as a master's student, I actually was open for many different ways, not necessarily staying in academia, and then was really inspired. Then back then, an assistant professor, a young Katya, who moved back from the US to Russia and actually played outstanding role for many young economists back then. I'm really so great that you agreed to give this lecture. The floor is yours, and we are looking forward for this talk.
Thank you very much, Galia, and thanks for the invitation. It's really a big pleasure to be here. Thanks for the organizers to choose this fantastic location, and let's get to the business. So before I actually gonna start talking about the topic of today's lecture, I just wanted to reflect in basically one sentence or two about how is that related to the name, the title of this lecture. And frankly, it's not that easy, you're gonna see. when I present my topic. And indeed, first of all, it's an honor. Second, I must say it's a humbling experience to give the Alfred Marshall Legacy lecture. And well, first of all, he's one of the founding fathers of our profession, for sure. And second of all, you know, he stays so much in foundation, and we are standing on the shoulders of people who are standing on the shoulders. And then in the foundation, there's Alfred Marshall. So I was trying to figure out how is my work related to what he was doing. And one way to spin it would be that, you know, in some ways, you know, one thing he was really, really preoccupied with was to understand how very seemingly small individual choices actually could aggregate into important outcomes in the public life through market interactions and through essentially social interactions. And if that's the way we can think of the Alfred Marshall's legacy, I would believe that what I'm going to talk about actually falls into that paradigm, but you know, it's up to you to judge that. And essentially everything which I'm going to talk to you about today will be related to one work, which is joint work with Georgy Yegorov, Sergei Guriev, and Maxim Mironov, and it's all going to be about the effectiveness of political information campaigns. So it's far from markets, but as you're going to see, it's going to be related to social interactions. And the paper's title is, I'd be surprisingly good for you, Political Information and Network Effects. So for those of you who are very young and who have no idea how to relate to the first part of the title of this paper, I would say that check out Lloyd Webber's very nice musical Evita. All right, so let's dive in. And the first important motivation for me in this work is to just generally think about what we have been learning over the years about the effectiveness of political information campaigns. And I must say that economists are the last ones who joined the forces to try to study this. So there was a lot of work in political science, social psychology, and then political economists also joined in. And generally, there's also first there was a lot of theoretical work. Then with the empirical revolution came the ways for us to identify the effects of the campaigns. And most of the work was about the average effects. And recently, particularly with the rise of the polarization, people have started to realize that there are very important heterogeneities in the effectiveness of political communication in general and political information campaigns in particular. And actually we can see that the papers which start talking about heterogeneity, they appeared, you know, the earliest ones, and I was proud contributor to some of them, appeared only 10 years ago, but most of the bulk of the research is really, you know, last 3 years or so. And if we think about the heterogeneities here, we can think about both heterogeneities at the individual level and at the aggregate level. At the individual level, we now understand, and partly because of the rise of the polarization, partly because of the rise of populism, we now understand that voters respond differently to the sometimes very same information. Some get persuaded, some are unaffected, and others may get dissuaded, even, you know, get outraged. That's going to be very important for what I will talk about today. And at the aggregate level, actually, even though most of the campaigns, at least to some extent, work on average, some are ineffective, and some actually may even backfire, producing unexpected outcomes. And just to illustrate this, here is a graph from a work which was published at APSR last year. This is not my work, it's Hewitt and others, political scientists have done it. They summarize, this is a meta-study, they summarize the result of 146 different interventions in the election campaigns in order to try to persuade voters to vote one way or the other in the US. And these were done in the 2 years, 2018-2020 in the US, and they covered 51 different US elections at the federal and at the state level. So what you see here is just the average treatment effects of these 146 studies. What you see, or the gray bars, are the results for individual studies. Interestingly so, to the left of the vertical bars, here we see quite a lot of those bars. Of course, on average treatment effects are positive, so many of these actual campaigns on average worked, but not all. And that's what I want to highlight here. Some really badly backfired. And the two outcomes we see here is, one is how favorable you are towards a particular candidate, and the other is actually voting choice of it. And related to that was another study also published last year at PNAS by social psychologists and political scientists, who actually tried to understand whether political practitioners who actually run those campaigns actually understand anything about them. In fact, the study was about the fact, can political practitioners tell us which messages will be persuasive and which not, and it turns out that they performed really, really badly. So that's one part of the motivation of where we're going to come in with this. The other part of the motivation comes from the other strand of the literature, which tries to think about the political information campaigns, and particularly recognizes that the campaigns influence the voting outcomes not only directly through effect on the exposed individuals, but also indirectly through their social circles. In particular, those people who are exposed to a particular political message through a campaign may sometimes choose to discuss campaign messages with their peers, with their friends, neighbors, and that potentially may have important persuasive effects in their own. So that will be also influencing attitudes and voting behavior. And there's a small but growing theoretical literature on this, but as far as the empirical literature so far, I could find only two very well identified papers. One of them, by the way, was published last year in the signature journal of this association in the EA. It's a wonderful paper by Enriquez et al. On Mexico, but the other is a working paper in Uganda. And the reason why you have this mismatch, despite the sort of our digital revolution and empirical revolution in economics, we don't have much work on the indirect spillover effects of political campaigns for a very important reason, which is that generally it's very challenging to do anything because the election outcomes are typically available only at the aggregated level. And at the same time, one should expect those indirect social effects of campaigns to be very, very local, because people literally talk to their circles, to their neighbors who vote in the same places. And therefore, the existing work so far had to rely on the geographical spillovers, which we do expect to be pretty minimal. Of course, generally surveys can help, and you can try to design that to be able to overcome these challenges, but that requires collecting a lot of sensitive information, and it may sometimes not be either feasible or reliable. So that's where we come in with this project I chose as a topic for this lecture, and we're going to bridge these two literatures essentially. First, we're going to improve tremendously, I hope. Well, let's see whether you would agree with me. Well, let me say we would improve, we believe, improve on the measurement of direct and indirect effects of a particular political information campaign. And we're going to try to understand how the heterogeneity in voter responses to it affects differentially the direct and indirect effects. And hopefully I'm going to come to the conclusions which will be both surprising and interesting and useful at the same time. So just to preview where we're going with that. So we're going to overcome this measurement issues I talked about by focusing on a very specific setting. And the very specific setting is the presidential elections in Argentina. And the reason why we're focusing on that is that the results there are reported separately for several groups of voters within the same electoral precincts. So when you came in and registered to this conference, you were directed to different tables depending on the first letter of your first name. But in Argentina, and actually in pretty much all countries, when you come to a polling station, you are directed to a table according to the first letter of your last name. But in all other countries but Argentina, at least to my best knowledge, everywhere the results afterwards are reported by precinct. In Argentina, the results are reported by table. So we're going to know what are the results for people with different last names within the same electoral precinct. And this is going to allow us to pinpoint the direct and indirect effect to much better extent than the prior work. And just to right away sort of hopefully spark some interest in this, we're going to show something which a priori seems quite unexpected, which is the direct and indirect effects can, and in our particular context, are of the opposite signs. And that surprising effect we're going to need to explain using the heterogeneity in voter responses to information. Okay? So what kind of heterogeneity you can think of? Let me just right away give you the bottom line so that you will be with me when I present our analysis. So I already told you that, of course, and I'm sure you agree, that many voters have very different reaction to the same type of information. But it's not only in terms of how persuasive this information is for them, but it also could be on how they choose to act on this information. And in particular, it could also translate into heterogeneity of how much these voters want to talk to others about this particular electoral campaign. And let me give you an example, which is now hypothetical, but will become a little bit more real as we go along, which is that let's imagine the situation in which a particular political campaign makes some people agree with it. They maybe learn some new information, they take on it, but it's along with their priors, so they say, yeah, great, now I understand what's happening. And then there are others who are really disagreeing with it and actually get outraged because they think that this campaign is actually wrong. So if we ask ourselves, who of these two type of individuals are going to be more likely to discuss it with others, that campaign, it's quite likely that we would agree that those who are outraged will be more likely to just come out and say, hey, see, there's this campaign against my candidate, let me explain why it goes wrong. So, and indeed, there's a lot of work in social psychology which emphasizes how important the emotions are both in persuasion and in getting people motivated and acting. So, but if that's the case, and if we imagine the situation where the minority of voters who are, for instance, outraged by this particular campaign mobilizes to explain their reaction to it to their peers, and the majority says, yeah, sure, that's reasonable, but given that, for them the reaction is emotionally neutral, they just say, okay, what else is new? There's nothing to talk about. Then you would expect the direct and indirect effects of the campaign to be of the opposite sign. And here, just before we dive into the context and the actual results, I want to say that to us, it's kind of important to understand how the direct and indirect effects work separately in order to understand the effects of the political campaigns, in order to understand the spread of political information and misinformation, and to essentially understand why the political practitioners for whom political campaigns are bread and butter actually struggle to predict their effects. They're really not good at their own work. So let me now come to the meat of that, and part of the meat is actually context. So I'm going to need to spend a little bit of time to tell you about what kind of context is there, because that's what allows us to push forward the frontier of knowledge on this particular topic. So The context is presidential elections in Argentina in 2023, and it's important that it was a big surprise for everybody, the results of these elections. So Javier Milei, who is a libertarian professor, excuse me, my gesture here, was an anti-establishment political outsider, not in politics at all. He unexpectedly won these elections, and while campaigning, he had really quite unorthodox and definitely unsustainable from the point of view of any economist policy proposals. And there are many of them, but we're going to focus on two in particular. One was about fully eliminating the central bank and dollarizing the economy, and his idea was that it's going to curb inflation. And the second proposal was just to completely eliminate the public secondary and high schools and replace that with the voucher system, only letting private schools in. And, well, you know, the Argentinian elections, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later with the context. They have another very interesting feature, which is that there is a primary which is mandatory for participation that comes before the first and the second round of the elections. And Milei won it unexpectedly, which led to a surge of the markets. Markets panicked. There was a huge depreciation of peso, so which meant that the markets didn't expect this to happen, and second, that they thought that it's pretty dangerous for the economy. So let me just in 1 second tell you how it was. So in August 13th, 2023, unexpectedly, Javier Milei won against the very important establishment candidates. Then in the first round, he lost only to the left-wing candidate Sergio Massa, and he came second. And in the runoff, which was in November, he won with 56% of the vote. So why are we looking at Argentina? For very important, unique features of its elections. One, I already talked to you about, the fact that we actually have elections at the result of these tables, which are called mesa, within every electoral precinct. And given that the voters are assigned to it alphabetically, this is as good as random. It definitely doesn't correlate with their political preferences, which is good for targeting. The second very important and also quite unique feature of Argentinian elections is that political parties are required by law to publish lists of individual members with name, surname, and address, which makes people who want to run political campaigns, provide them with a very useful tool, which is individual information addresses of the voters you can target. And given that you know their address and their last name, you know which mesa they're voting for. Again, it's quite amazing type of information. And finally, as I already mentioned, before the first round and runoff, there is another round, zero round of elections called PASO, which is the mandatory primary, which determines the eligible candidates for the elections, and that allows researchers like me to identify these mesas, these tables, which are comparable in terms of the voter preferences. So all of this we're going to use for our analysis. So what do we do in this research? Well, we're going to use the willingness of one of the NGOs in Argentina to try to do something about this electoral campaign. This is a non-partisan NGO, but they really thought that Milei was a threat. And they decided that they're going to run a political campaign, particularly in one of the provinces, which is the one where Milei got the biggest number of votes. I'm going to tell you about that a little later. So what we did, we paired with them, we helped them to design the campaign so that we can evaluate the effects, okay? And what this NGO wanted to do, it wanted to send the voters the messages that the policy proposals by Milei actually have a very, very real risk of hurting the poor voters. And given that it's the poorest province in Argentina they targeted, that was a reasonable thing to do. Okay? So in the campaign, I'm going to show you that, but let me just right away tell you what's it about. The campaign was about sending leaflets, the electoral sort of campaign information leaflets, by regular mail to voters using these lists which are publicly available to them. It's important to note that we as researchers didn't touch the individual information. We only worked with the aggregate level information, so that was NGO who sent the individual letters. But we were able to design the experiment so that we can measure what the effects of that were. So how did we help this NGO? Well, we first, randomized the precincts, electoral precincts, into those which would be potentially treated and not. And then we found the tables, the methods within these precincts which would be comparable in the control and treated precincts. And then we also randomized the intensity of treatments, how many measures, voters and how many measures were reached by this NGO. So the aim of the NGO was to essentially dissuade voters to vote for Milei. Our aim was different. We wanted to estimate the direct and indirect effects of these campaigns separately. And here, again, the direct effect is the effect of receiving this leaflet yourself in your house by mail, whereas the indirect effect is if you didn't receive that leaflet, but others in your precinct do. How does it change your vote? Through social interactions. So, and now let me, before I give you the details of the data and everything, let me tell you where I'm going with that. So what we've learned, and that was something which certainly the NGO wasn't super happy with, there was the following result, that on average, the campaign essentially backfired slightly. In other words, on average, because of this campaign, the Milei got more votes. And that was true, in the first round, and we actually replicated the results. I'm going to talk about that in the second round, and it was still true. But there is more to it, which makes it, academically maybe more interesting. Well, for the NGO, that was maybe not so great no matter what, but still, it was more puzzling. But what's important for us is that we saw that the direct effect of this campaign was actually positive, effective, and very persuasive. In particular, per 100 leaflets which the NGO sent, they got, as a result of that, 20 fewer votes for Milei. Right? So essentially, when you directly expose some voters to these messages which criticize Milei, it works. At the same time, what we see is that indirect effects are completely different. In particular, we see that for 100 leaflets sent, there were 30 more votes for Milei among those who didn't get the actual leaflets, but live in the places where others got them. Well, that seemed to be pretty surprising to us, and it was particularly surprising to the NGO, because they were saying, okay, we were doing the focus groups. We saw that these messages, were working. So how is this possible that campaign backfires despite the fact that it's being persuasive on average on treated individuals? And that's where we're going to need to use both theory, our knowledge of heterogeneity of the campaign, of the effects of the campaign, and we actually conducted a survey, which I hopefully will get time to get to be able to try to pin down the mechanism behind these surprising, at least to the first glance, surprising results. Yeah, so Right. So let me just, try to go forward with that. As far as the literature is concerned, I just want to say that we try to bridge these two literatures. One is on the heterogeneity in campaigns, and the other on spillovers. All right. So how do we actually measure these effects? Even though we were actually free, the NGO allowed us to randomize all sorts of different things, it's actually not that obvious how we should, or at least, we thought it was obvious to start with, then we thought again, and we realized that it may not be as obvious as we thought to start in the beginning of how one should measure direct effects. In particular, and indirect effects as well. So in particular, as far as direct effects is concerned, even though we do have information which is much more granular at the mesa level rather than at the electoral precinct level, we still don't have individual level information on voting because the vote is secret, right? So we're going to need to really convince ourselves and our readers, and hopefully I'll convince you that we are able to pin it down, because it will be the case that the direct treatment effects of these campaigns are proportional to the share of individuals in treated masses, and the indirect effects are proportional to the individuals who are treated in the whole precinct, but if you focus on masses where no individual was treated. In order to be able to make that assertion, we need to assume something which actually seems to be pretty innocuous, but I want to be explicit about that anyway, which is that the indirect effect of the campaigns is the same in all masses. In other words, your first letter of your last name does not correlate with how you interact with individuals who have other letters who have any other last names, let's say, right? So in order to get to this, we basically going to, you could think about that as a toy structural model. We're going to do a little bit of theory, but the theory is going to be very simple, and I'm not going to bore you with that a lot, but let me just outline it very, very briefly. So first of all, let me step back and say that we just take off the shelf something which is very, very basic. It would be like page 15 of the most basic theory textbooks on political economy, which is the probabilistic voting model, all right? So, and then we're going to try to augment it by introducing the electoral campaigns in it, okay? And then see how the electoral campaigns affect the aggregate vote at the level of precinct, right? So let's consider a precinct. I would want to, again, remind you that the precinct is a very small geographical unit. It's essentially school. Most of the time in Argentina, but in most countries, in France as well, it's by school. So we consider an electoral precinct where everybody are neighbors, and let's say that it's populated by voters, well, for simplicity, continuum of the mass of one, and these voters belong to different groups. And the groups are the groups by the policy preferences. So within the same electoral precincts, there are people on the left, on the right, on the center, populists, what have you. So this is G. So they're the policy preferences. And these groups could have different sizes, okay? That's NG there. And it turns out, and that's how we model it, these people in the precinct vote in different messes, in different tables. And the one important assumption we make here is that the split of citizens into groups is orthogonal to their split into messes. In other words, the first letter of your last name doesn't tell me anything about your political preferences. Okay, that's it's a pretty innocuous assumption, right? So then, and here is a still, textbook material. So there are two candidates. And we call them A and B according to their policy proposals. And in each group, so voters with different preferences in each group, the voter I within the group votes for candidate A rather than B if and only if they prefer their policy proposal net of some random shock to popularity, and that's epsilon here. So that random shock could be positive and negative. It's uniformly distributed, very, very simple setup. So all of this is just textbook. But now we're going to put on some treatment effects to that. So let's suppose that there is a political information campaign which tries to affect the vote here. And let's suppose that this campaign treats the share tau m of voters in massa m. Importantly, and I would like to stress it here because it's going to be important for empirics, each voter in group G is treated with the same probability, but different groups within that same massa could be treated with different probabilities. And I'm going to come to why that is in a second empirically, but it's important to say that, you know, for the campaign, it's easier to reach some voters than others for some reason, okay? Maybe I should say it right away. Why? Because actually the type of information, personal information, which NGO used in order to send the leaflets was from the party lists. And of course, party lists mean that these are special voters which belong to a particular party. That's why we make that generalization here. So we really need to make the possibility that different groups of voters are reached with different probabilities. So, and then we say that the utility of a voter in group G from voting for a candidate A, let's say, if treated, changes by a certain amount. And that doesn't depend on which massa it is. It depends only on your preferences, okay? But of course, whether you are treated or not, that depends on the massa. So that's basically how we measure the direct effect. How do we measure the indirect effect? Well, there we model the following social interactions that each member of a particular group or within this precinct hears from some other people in that same precinct about the election and about the election campaign from a sort of random person of another group with certain probability. And that probability, again, could depend on both groups. So there are some people who are more likely to socialize with each other because they have more close political preferences. There are others which never talk to each other. So we take that, we built in that in the model. And again, we say that there is, you know, some way in which this interaction changes the voting choices of the receiver of this social interaction. Importantly, both for direct effect and for indirect effect, we model it completely, let's say, generally. So it could be positive effect, it could be negative effect, on zero effect. Okay? So the only thing, and I know, I'm sorry I bored you with some of the details of the model here, but the most important takeaway from the slide is that sort of the way we formulated it, we think it's actually close to the reality, but it's important to spell it out, that the direct treatment effect depends on the massa, because the massas are going to be, voters in the massas are going to be treated. But the indirect effect works in the whole precinct. We allow people in precinct randomly socialize with each other. So everybody in the precinct have the same type of sort of social environment, which is political social environment in this particular case. So with that, and I must say that there's quite a lot of math, which I skip here, and I'm gonna, put this equation, which we're gonna estimate to a bare minimum. So essentially, the total vote for a candidate A in massa M of this precinct can be written down as the top equation there, where the first term is actually coming directly from the probabilistic voting model. So those of you who read that textbook recognize it immediately and know what alpha stands for. But then there are two other terms. which are the some kind of coefficient beta multiplied by the share of treated voters in mesa M, and some coefficient gamma multiplied by the share of treated voters in precinct P. And it turns out that beta is essentially something which is directly proportional to the direct persuasion effect of the campaign, and gamma is directly proportional to the persuasion power of the social interactions net of the direct campaign. These two coefficients also actually depend on which groups are more likely to treat and other parameters which we're going to be able to control for explicitly. And then, you know, for those of you who really love probability voting model, it's worth noting that alpha, of course, increases with the size and density of the group, which is something you read in the textbooks. But the important thing for us here is that what's happening with this beta and gamma, because we actually really want to directly bring this equation to the data. So we're going to regress the Milei's vote share in a given mesa on the share of voters treated in this mesa, on the share of voters treated in the entire precinct, and we claim that we will be able to recover directly the direct and indirect effect, but that's with some important caveats. And what are these caveats? The first one is that tau M and tau P meet to vary exogenously. Well, we're going to be able to do this because of our experimental design, but what's important also, we're going to need to very explicitly and seriously control for the differences in political preferences of those voters which we can target with higher probability compared to those which we target with lower probability. In other words, we're going to need to account for the fact that NGO used the lists of Peronist party, which is one of the biggest parties in Argentina, to actually run this campaign. Okay? All right. So let me see where am I with time. So what are we going to do here? I think I went to another direction. So we're going to bring that you call it structural model if you want, but maybe you know, those of you who are structuralists are laughing now because it's pretty simple. Although required some math, to the data. And as far as the data concerned, I'll skip this. It's maybe too much detail for this format, but what we need to know, and the context here is important, is that the NGO wanted to target this place. So this is the Salta province in Argentina. It's the 7th largest. It's the poorest one, and the one where Milei got the largest share of votes, surprisingly, in this primary, which is called PASO. So that province is organized into 22 departments, and once you take out the capital city, which is a pretty large and vibrant city, everything else is rural, and we're going to only focus on the rural areas because otherwise we won't have the comparison group. We also would worry that geographical spillovers between different precincts within the same Santa city could be present. So we're going to look at rural areas, and there are 209 rural precincts, and within them, altogether, there are 1,200, a little bit more, of these messes, the tables, at which level we have the electoral information. So how we're going to design this experiment? We will we take all of these precincts, and then we split them randomly into two halves. Some we, for the first round experiment, right after we got this PASO vote and NGO really wanted to do something, so we split them into halves. One half we don't touch because these are essentially pure controls. There are no voter treated in these pure control precincts, and the other half we split again randomly into those which would potentially be targeted by the inflation message, and the others which would be targeted with education message. And then, well, and the reason for this is quite simple, because we don't want to have within the same precinct people targeted by different messages, because otherwise we're not going to be able to interpret the indirect effect of the campaigns, okay? So then for each mesa within these potential treatment precincts, we find another mesa which is in the pure control precincts, which looks exactly the same in terms of the Milei vote share, turnout, and the share of these, what we call the available addresses, which are the target audience of this NGO, okay? So we try to get, very micro in how comparable the places are, because we weren't really sure whether sort of leaflet, which I'm going to show you in a second, will at all work in any way. And it turned out that to some extent that was a reasonable worry. I'm going to get to that in a second. So whenever match is unavailable, which were very few actually, then we say that we're not going to treat that mesa. And after that, we're going to randomly vary the intensity of treatment by assigning precincts into high-intensity treatment and low-intensity treatment, and after that randomize again and pick the mesas within these precincts to treat. And that was subject to one constraint, which is a budget constraint of the NGO, which only could print at the time 10,000 leaflets and send them off. And there were 5,000 leaflets in the education treatment and 5,000 leaflets in the inflation treatment. And the education treatment essentially told the voters that Milei's proposal to replace free public secondary education with these vouchers is a really, really bad idea. And it included fact-checking of the claims he did, because he was saying that it will work fantastically. And it also included the quotes from the Argentines' largest teachers union, which apparently, that's what the NGOs was convinced of, is really a respected organization locally in Argentina. And it all gave all the sources. And as far as the inflation treatment is concerned, it's kind of similar. I'm going to show you the picture of the leaflet in a second. Bear with me. But let me walk you through the content of it. So again, this leaflet presents the Milei's proposal to dollarize the economy and eliminate the central bank. And then it shows how market reacted to this passive vote when suddenly Milei won it. And that was both peso depreciation and huge price increases. And then, it basically cites several experts, economic experts, which are named with all the sources, saying that given the macroeconomic context, the dollarization could trigger even larger devaluation and even larger inflation, and both will hurt voters. So importantly, the NGO was serious about it. They designed these leaflets especially for that, and they printed them in a special printing house. So it's not, it looked pretty professional, like part of the campaign. So this is, So this would be the leaflet on education. So here's the translation of it, but I'll skip it for the sake of time because I told you what's it about. But generally, it looked pretty professional. Importantly, it's just one sheet of paper which is folded, and therefore there are 4 pages, 2 front, 2 back. And here is so this is the map of precincts which we randomized the treatment into. That also can be skipped. And here is how the inflation treatment leaflet looks again. So it asks you, what was the effect of that, and then it shows the effect on prices, including featuring the very important for Argentinian culture, the price of meat, which is absolutely the NGO thought should work, basically. Yeah, and again, here is the translation. Let me skip it. So that was the experiment we ran. The time flies. I was flashed that I have still only 5 minutes to go, but I'm gonna be very quick. So we ran that between the PASO and the first round, but then we were so surprised with these effects which we got, we then pre-registered the opposite sign effects for the direct and indirect effect and ran the campaign again with another 500 or 5,000 leaflets, but using some of the pure control precincts to target between this first and second round of elections, okay? Right, so let me then be very, very quick, with any type of experiment where you have a randomization, you need to verify that the randomization actually worked. And in our case, it worked perfectly. However, there's a very important caveat that working perfectly doesn't mean that we actually have balance, because our treatment variable is not whether method was treated or not, what we randomized. Our treatment variable is the percent of voters who've been treated. And for that, we needed to work harder to get balance. Particularly, we need to control flexibly for the share of available addresses. But actually, for the runoff experiment, we actually needed also to add the entropy balancing to really make sure that we're looking at the comparable things, which, importantly, did not really affect results whatsoever. So now let me actually come to the results, which you already anticipate because I've told you what they are about. So this is the estimation of our structurally derived equation, where we see that there is a negative significant effect of the share of treated voters in the table, and the positive significant effect of the share of treated voters in precinct, controlling for all sorts of different things, including the fixed effects of the pairs for the comparable methods, okay, in control and treatment. Importantly, however, when we run it this way, and that's theoretically designed, we may worry that these two things correlate, which they do, of course, because mesa is part of the precinct. So the question is, can we estimate that separately? And of course, we can by doing the following. As far as the direct effect is concerned, we can control out all of the indirect effect if we stick in the precinct fixed effect. But then we cannot compare messes to the messes in other precincts, but we can compare the messes within the same precinct, those which were treated more and less. And as far as the indirect effect is concerned, if we only focus on those messes which weren't treated, we're gonna get the indirect effect there. And that's what we can do, and that's what's presented in this table. Again, and I'm sorry to rush a little bit, we get exactly the same effect where the direct effect is as designed and pretty affected, but indirect effect is large and of the opposite sign, giving us the negative effect altogether. Let me just say that we verified that it's really true over the whole distribution of votes. So this is just a raw data where we vary the treatment intensity, both in direct and indirect effect, and we see that the distribution shift the way we would expect that. Let me be very, very quick on this. So now the one other substantive point. So we did that experiments, which I described, and these are all about education experiment. I'm going to come, maybe now it's good to say that we found nothing on no effect on inflation leaflets whatsoever. And I'm going to come to if I have time, I'll tell you why, but generally, sort of maybe now I want to preview that, saying that the NGO afterwards understood that the PASO made markets panic so much that everybody, even in the rural South, learned about it. So basically, the inflation treatment wasn't news for any of the voters. However, the education treatment was, and here we see that when substitute the outcome variable, which is vote for Milei in the first round by the runoff, we see that this first experiment which we ran, actually the results of it persists. But what's interesting, the direct effect is exactly as it was, but the indirect effect increases in magnitude, which actually, again, highlights something important about social interactions, because people had more time, another month, to discuss this campaign with others, which made it even more important and backfire, even higher for the resulting vote. Okay, so let me skip the robustness here. So then, given that we really wanted to make sure that it's real, we ran another experiment, and got the very similar effects, again, very consistent. Let me skip forward to this and come to the following that, well, let me, maybe I got a sign from Galina that I need to wrap up, so I will skip a few other things. So we were also worried a little bit that we might have some, it could, we could have that, it's very unlikely, but we could get these results by chance. Of course, once we replicate it, the probability of that is even smaller, but then we basically did the placebo where we randomized differently and use the same data and see what are the chances that we're going to get these effects, and the answer is no chance, basically. So with that, we were very confident in our results. Now the question is, so can we say something about the mechanism? And that brings me back to my opening slide about the heterogeneity. So given that, when we were doing this campaign, or the NGO was doing this campaign, we didn't have any access to voters or anything. We needed to do our own study to be able to get to the mechanism. So, and unfortunately, or fortunately for Milei, and maybe unfortunately for that NGO also, but so for us as researchers, unfortunately, the Milei changed his status completely. Now he's a mainstream, and actually his policies were much more moderate than what he promised in his electoral campaign. So we couldn't really use that same leaflet. So we decided to run a survey with the essentially presenting people in the rural Salta with a hypothetical scenario. We just told them, let's say there's a game. We imagine something, which is that we imagine that we are in an election before Javier Milei, when Fernandez was still a president, and there are two candidates. One is traditional, long-established party. The other is new person who is not a politician, who wants to fight corruption, change things in the country. And this is a non-traditional candidate, and the election is close, so he has a real chance of winning. And let's imagine that you receive a colorful leaflet which criticizes one of his proposals, and the leaflet, we say, says that the non-traditional candidate, if that non-traditional candidate implements this proposal, that will harm poor people, according to some expert. I would like to underscore the some here. And then for half of these people in our survey, we say, suppose you believe that the leaflet is reasonable, and that leaflet makes you inclined to vote less for that candidate, and the other half, who were those people who had odd birth dates of the month, and the others even birthdays of the month, they said, so they got the following scenario. Suppose you do not believe the leaflet and think that it was made specifically to attack this new non-traditional candidate, and that makes you, if anything, more inclined to vote for him. So, and then we basically, in that survey, have a very simple outcome, which is two types of outcomes. How likely it is that you would discuss the content of this leaflet with your neighbors and friends, and if so, for how many? And then, even though this is all hypothetical and the power is not that great, I mean, we also had a budget constraint, not only the NGO, and yet we actually do get the effects which we would expect, which is that people who were asked to imagine that they do not believe the leaflet, they think they would discuss this content with the larger number of neighbors and friends. So we don't have the significant effects, although in the right sign, for the likelihood of discussing. But if we ask, so how many people are going to talk about that, then we start getting the effects. And that brings me to the essentially conclusion slide here, where what do we learn from this exercise? So first of all, the direct and indirect effects of an information political campaign need not be of the same sign. And it's important that backfiring is possible despite the fact that the campaign would be working on average on those who are treated. And what are the lessons from this? Well, the lesson is that this helps explain why anti-elite candidates are so difficult to defeat. even when the messages perform well in the focus groups, because that's what the NGO was really stunned about, essentially. And this is why political practitioners are always lost. And I would like to just finish with one sentence that, even though we hope that we make contribution with this work, there's a lot more, both theoretical and empirical research, which is needed to better understand how people process the political information when they become the ambassadors of ideas. And I hope that you will join me and produce fantastic research on that topic. And I'm looking forward to learning about it, reading it, and receiving it at AR. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katya. Let's just get a couple of minutes for questions. Are there any questions from the audience?
Just a curiosity. Is it true that a message from this work would be that the NGO should target people that are very isolated, have small social circles, if you can identify them?
Sure, that is definitely true, with one caveat that maybe one should think about the messages which do not antagonize others, then you will have a much better impact. So the targeting isolated voters may work, but it's a very expensive enterprise. Precisely because what you hope for is to have the message which becomes viral, and it actually is persuasive, and that's not what they so far managed to do.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. I was wondering, could this also be interpreted as kind of saying that negative campaigning maybe does not work, and one should maybe spend more effort on sort of positive campaigning, promoting the strengths and ideas of a particular candidate rather than attacking the ideas of another one? Or?
That's an excellent point, and I think we need much more research to be able to answer this, but I tend to agree with you that in many of the instances in which I have studied the election campaigns, and there were quite a few, whenever there were dirty negative campaigning, it actually was more likely, in this particular context I studied, I really need to be careful to say that, they were more likely to backfire, or at least they also, the other thing which was a likely outcome in some of them is that people sort of tend to disengage more. That's another thing. I haven't mentioned it here, that in the Argentinian context, when the stakes were so high, the peso was plummeting, and also on top of that, the elections, the turnout is mandatory. There are no effects on turnout. Of course, even though there's mandatory turnout, there is still some variation. Not everybody go to work. And the fine is like equal to 2 US cents if you don't go to the election. So it's not very, very expensive for the people to not comply with that regulation. But generally, in those places where turnout is another very important margin, you could basically make people disengage from politics, and that could have lasting important effects as well. So generally, I think it's a really good point, but we need more systematic research on that. If we have time, there's somebody here. Oh, there. Okay.
Just quick one. Do you have a clue about which kind of messages trigger the backlash? So I guess it's future research, but do you have a hunch of where we should go? So the micro effect, not the aggregate effect.
Right. So what I have a hunch, and I think we're gonna try to be able to answer that question better, but I can tell you in what sense. So, and it's not really necessarily about the messages per se, but the messages interacted with context. Because we honestly got the results of the survey just a week ago. So the last part on the mechanism is really, really new, and there is more outcomes in that survey, which has to do with the fact that what would have happened had the campaign be against the messages of not a political outsider, not a sort of potential populist, although now people don't consider Milei as populist, but certainly he was certainly anti-establishment. And things are very, very, and we seem to receive the result that people have very, very different attitude to how they treat information about the mainstream, which, by the way, leads back, and I haven't thought about it, I just now thought about that leads back to the other work which I've been doing on the effect of internet and social media on incumbents. Incumbents are thought very differently from the outsiders. When you attack outsiders, people are much more likely to get sort of very emotional against that type of attack. People are very, very receptive to the messages which criticize the incumbents generally. So that's one thing which we see, I think. Although that's not exactly what you asked, but that's as much as I can react to right now to this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katya.
Okay, we're gonna talk about that later. Thank you.
Yeah.